Welcome to Larry the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, let's discuss the Kinks, low budget. The Kinks are an interesting group for me. There's two things that when I think about the Kinks, or as I was starting to get ready for this episode, I'm always struck by two things. How long they've been around. Their first album came out in 1964. I mean, that is before Jimi Hendrix. That's before The Cream. I'm pretty sure that's before The Who. You know, very, very early on. The Kinks have been around forever, and they've put out a ton of albums. The other thing that I'm always struck when I think about the Kinks is how many songs they have. How many you don't realize how many hit songs they have until you start like sitting down and thinking about it, because again, they've been around for so long. And when I was in high school, I talk about this, how when I was growing up, I don't know if it was the area that I was in or my age, I was like at sort of an in-between age that classic rock was really, really popular with my friends, as was the stuff that was happening at that time. So the stuff that was happening at that time was like MTV, hard rock, and metal and stuff like that. But a lot of kids were really into classic rock. And I remember my friends that had older brothers and stuff like that. They were all into Led Zeppelin and the Beatles and the Stones. And I liked all that stuff too, as did all my friends. And so the Kinks, they were a band that everybody knew Lola, and everybody liked that song, and You Really Got Me because of Van Halen. I knew about that because Van Halen covered You Really Got Me and All Day and All the Night. But I really didn't know much about the Kinks, and it wasn't until this album came out, and this also surprised me too. When I went to get ready for this video and was listening to this record, I was thinking in my head that this was like 82, 83 or something. But this is actually 1979, so that surprised me a little bit. And I think this was an album that in some ways put them back in the U.S. at least. It brought up their profile again in the U.S. And again, it wasn't that like nobody knew who they were, because they had these other songs that did get played a lot on classic rock radio. But this sort of brought them back, I think, onto U.S. radio, because this had some pretty big hits on it. And Catch Me Now I'm Falling, Wish I Could Fly Like Superman, those were two songs that got played a lot on the radio. I remember hearing Low Budget. So there were, two or three songs that got a lot of radio airplay here in the States. And so it's kind of interesting. Like I've been looking for, I don't have a lot of Kinks albums in my collection. I have this, I have Misfits, and I have One for the Road. And I think that's all I have. And I've been searching for, I really want to get Lola and Power Man and Arthur, but I never see these records when I'm out, which is really crazy because I can't remember which one of those Lolas. Maybe Lola and Power Man is at the album that I never see these records. And it's confusing to me because, if I go out, I see tons of Who records and stuff like that, or I'll see, of course, tons of Led Zeppelin records, but I don't see a lot of Kinks records from the 70s. Maybe it's just the shops that I go to, but I go to a lot of record shops, and it's become this thing where I'm like always checking because I really want to get those two albums, because what I've listened to, they sound really interesting. And again, they're a band like that I don't really know a whole heck of a lot about outside of their earlier hits. And this album and the next studio album that will come out, Give the People What They Want, that was the one with Destroyer, that song on it, that got played like crazy on the radio. But I just, for some reason, don't know a lot about their 70s stuff. And going back to like my friends and everything, all my friends, we had all the Led Zeppelin records, Deep Purple, the Beatles, the Stones. And although we liked the Kinks songs we heard on the radio, I don't remember anybody having like all their records. So I've never really known anybody that was really, really into the Kinks, like where they had all the records. Like I have friends that know everything about Pink Floyd, or they know everything about the Doors and stuff. But that's not the case with the Kinks. And I remember I was talking to Darren from Sabbath Sunday about this, and I said, it's just funny. I don't remember like any kids in my school ever wearing Kinks shirts and stuff like that. And he seemed to remember. He seemed to say, I had friends that were really into them and would wear their shirts and stuff like that. And so maybe it was just where I was. But from the little bit of reading and everything, the research that I've been doing on them, it seems like that through the 70s they were huge over in the UK, or maybe all of Europe. I don't really know. So maybe people out there can comment. How big were the Kinks outside of the hits like Lola and You Really Got Me? How big were the Kinks where you were in the 70s? Because again, they put out a ton of albums. I mean, this album is their 18th studio album. I mean, my gosh, this is 1979 and they're already on their 18th studio album. So I'm curious, how big were they where you were? Let me know down in the comments down below. And I'm especially curious about people from the UK, like were they seem like they were really popular there. And another thing that surprised me is how many songs Ray Davies has written outside of the Kinks for other people. He wrote a ton of like hit songs for pop artists, people that maybe didn't really have hits here in the US, but over in Britain and stuff, they seem to be popular. So I'm curious. Let me know how popular the Kinks were. If you're outside the U.S., how popular were the Kinks? Even if you are in the U.S., were they popular amongst your peer group and stuff like that? Let me know. So on to this album. This was my first album that I ever had from the Kinks. I remember I got it from a record club, a tape. I had a cassette of it. And it's a great album. There's a lot of really cool songs on it. It's produced by Ray Davies. I'd say the production is pretty good. It's a little dated, but it's not for 1979. I think that it's pretty good. The guitars sound good. Everything's in check. You can hear everything. Attitude. The album opens with Attitude. That's a fun one. And the Kinks. Here's another thing about the Kinks. They always seem to straddle this line for me. They certainly weren't heavy metal, but they influenced heavy metal. You'll hear people talk about You Really Got Me and All Day and All the Night, that distorted guitar sound being very influential on heavy metal. But they're never a metal band for me. They're a hard rock band, but they were never really that hard rock. And for me, they also had a little bit of a punk sound in them, new wave / punk. I don't know how to quite put my finger on it, and I don't know if I've ever really heard anybody else say this. Maybe I'm completely off, but see if you agree with me on this. Did they? I feel like they sort of had an influence a little bit on maybe some of the new wave bands, especially come like now the late 70s. Maybe they influenced some of the new wave bands, and maybe they even had a little bit of an influence on the punk bands. Their look was never really like this sort of super long hair hippie kind of look. It seemed like they always had a little bit more of a, at least the images that I remember of them from like this era was more like suit and ties, and their hair was a little bit shorter. So I don't know. Maybe am I off by that? Does anybody else hear that too? A little bit of a new wave, a little bit of maybe a punk thing influencing punk. I should say them influencing the new wave, not them being influenced by those things. But all right, so Attitude, it's a great album opener. It's got a lot of energy. I love the like attitude, your attitude, who the way they do that. I think is really fun. Catch Me Now I'm Falling. I mentioned that. That's one of the popular songs. As a 10-year-old kid, 11-year-old kid, I was still into comic books at this time. So to hear them make the "This is Captain America Calling" reference, I was a huge Captain America fan. That was cool. We get another superhero sort of thing here on the end of side one with "Wish I Could Fly Like Superman." Pressure's cool. It's sort of, upbeat. It's got a little bit of, again, that sort of punkish energy to it. National Health. This is the other thing about the Kinks. They had a little bit of a sense of humor to their music, and National Health has that for me, like the lyrics. And there's like some weird, I don't know what it is, a keyboard sound or like a drum sound in it. This electronic sound that's kind of funny. Low Budget, the title track, open side 2. That's fun again. The lyrics are sort of funny. And from what I understand, in the 70s they were doing a lot of concept records, and this and like the earlier album Misfits was them sort of moving away from these concept records and being a little bit more with what was going on at the time. In a Space is fun. A little bit of emotion. I've always loved Ray Davies. His ballads like Celluloid Heroes. I absolutely love that song. It's one of my favorite ballads. So a little bit of emotion has that. I think that's great. The rest of the album the last 3 songs on the record the budget runs out for me on these songs. A Gallon of Gas is just sort of a forgettable blues. I don't really like Misery, and I don't like Moving Pictures. But again, they're an interesting group. Ray Davies, great songwriter, good singer. Maybe he doesn't have like quite the unique over-the-top voice of like a Robert Plant or an Ian Gillan. Dave Davies, good guitar player, but not like Jimmy Page or Richie Blackmore or Uli Roth or Tony Iommi. He doesn't jump out at you the way that those players do. We have Jim Rudford on bass and Mike Avery on drums, which they're competent. Again, there's nothing like from a musical standpoint very adventurous or anything. It's just good, well-written songs. And I guess when I think of the Kinks, that's what I think of. I think of Ray Davies. He just seems like he's a good songwriter, and it seems like a lot of stuff comes together with them on this record. And maybe a little bit ahead of its time, 1979. Again, I thought it was from like 82, 83, because that's what it sort of feels like. But so maybe a little bit ahead of its time, predicting where the 80s would go and stuff like that. So, all right, there you go. The Kinks, Low Budget. Let me know what you guys think of this album. Let me know the impact of the Kinks for you, for wherever you are outside of the U.S. How big of an impact did they have? Especially, I'm curious, especially in the 70s. How important were they? During that era for where you were. Okay. I would get After This One for the Road. I do really like that. That's a great live album, and give the people what they want. But then I sort of lost track of what the Kinks were doing. But all right, let me know what you guys think of Low Budget. Let me know what you guys think of the Kinks. Till we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.